The more I sit back and look at the Daytona playing field, there's so many examples that we see today, the more I feel like the future of the Daytona is not in steel. That's a hot take. And I find it hilarious that we've been so fixated on stainless steel, but in the background they have created infinite variations in precious metal. For all the inherent hype, the interest and disinterest in the Daytona, it is fascinating to see how this watch began and how it evolved. Where it began as a humble sports watch that nobody wanted. Frankly, at that time there were far better chronographs that you could buy, and this watch was seen as nothing very special. Until today we see that it has become one of Rolex's flagship watches, their most premier sports watch that garners a lot of attention, and as we have seen, it never stops. But what I love is that the 116-500 LN, the stainless steel variation they introduced in 2016 with the ceramic bezel, this watch has probably done more for the image of the Daytona, for its development, the way it is perceived today, than any other watch in its collection. Unless you've been living under a rock or this is your first video you've seen on the Daytona, 2023 is its 60th anniversary, so naturally we're expecting to see something quite grand, especially considering that in 2013 we saw the quote-unquote 50th anniversary model that wasn't technically the 50th anniversary release, but it was beautiful, platinum case, bracelet, brown bezel, brown subdials, with this gorgeous light blue dial. And even though Rolex made no claims that it was their 50th anniversary model, it's a piece that even right now could stand by itself as one of the most beautiful watches that they've ever made. So today we're discussing leaks and predictions. I'm sure you've seen quite a few already, but I think the way these leaks are presented are very valid to an extent that we might be able to justify how our predictions could go. Now, I'm about 90% of the way there believing that these images are true, and it's not so much the Daytona I'm looking at, but the Submariner, because it's also the Submariner's 70th anniversary. I made a video about this and discussed how green was going to be one of their core inclusions, like it's always been. This is a very smart play of giving us an all-gold Hulk Submariner, Hulk dial, Hulk bezel. This feels very true to form, the fact that they are using leftover parts and putting it into a model with a reference number 126618 LV, which also checks out nicely. And then looking across at the Daytona, a watch that's celebrating its 60th, the reference 116508 LN. This also does appear pretty legitimate. At this stage, you only see this dial, bezel, and case configuration with a rubber strap. Is it as exciting as the 50th anniversary watch? I don't believe so. Could this just be one of many precious metal Daytonas they give us? Possibly. So what can we take away from this? There are two scenarios. The ideal scenario, if we think back to 2020, the entire Submariner line was revamped. New case, dial, bracelets, a whole new collection, stainless steel, precious metals, new color variations, new bezel inserts, as well as the fact that same year we saw an entirely new Oyster Perpetual line. For us as enthusiasts, that's the dream, to see the Daytona revitalized with the 126-500 collection and the many other precious metal variations on top of it. But the not ideal situation, looking back at these leaked images again, I can either confirm or deny whether they are genuine or not. Something tells me that we're not going to see this refresh. No, it's a 1165, it's not using a new movement, it's not an increase in size. I mean, even the dial and bezel, it's not a new configuration. Like most of you, I'd love to see this watch tweaked in size. I would love to see it modernized just that little bit more, that incremental adjustment that Rolex is known for. But then again, I have my doubts. And it's especially how we look at the Daytona climate and how these watches are perceived. So let's try and rationalize a few of these points. The development of the Daytona, it's no longer a tool. We look to the 60s and how these watches began as sports, utilitarian pieces, how they then changed in the 80s and through until now. They've become luxurious, glamorized objects. They emphasize polish, precious metals, bespoke dial configurations, bezel inserts. I believe this collection in particular is the one that has the most hands-on time of any watch in the Rolex family. Which means as much as we view them as the sports watch, and we seem to have our heads stuck in that genre because we love talking about it, these pieces are very much their artisanal property, and this is where they spend most of the time experimenting with gem setting. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the Daytona also experimented with oyster flex first. So they're also playing around with technology. And then we get into that controversial point about an increase in size from 39 mils to 41 mils. I, like some of you out there, would like to see this watch upped in size. If you've ever had a Daytona on the wrist, you'll know it's not the most legible chronograph in the world. But again, if we back out and we look at the landscape that this watch appeals to, it's not only men, it's also women. 39mm is a perfect unisex size. And the fact that these pieces take that artisanal approach and emphasize jewelry more than any other watch in Rolex's sports lineup, it's fair to say that this watch's size will stay the same. We should also bear in mind that the size increase of the Submariner, the GMT, hell, the new Challenge Sea Dweller that we've just seen. This was done for a practical purpose because these watches are still used as instruments. So for this video, I threw together some renders of what I would love to see. Some color variations, less text on the dial. The watch increased in size by a few millimeters. The subdials filled. When we look at these white dial Panda variations, the 116500 on the left, the 126500 on the right, simple adjustments. And I think the model on the right is the perfect example of what the modern Daytona should look like, especially in steel. But it's also very difficult to adjust this watch and to be creative with it. Because when you look to the text on the dial, we know that they will never change those 5 lines. The way that the subdials at the 3 and at the 9 have been shifted up, this has become their calling card. The fact that this watch has a ceramic bezel and crown guards, it's a piece that's aiming to be rugged, it can take a hit. But I believe it's a piece that will not lose what it has already established. And to change the case dimensions and proportions, next to the thousands of variations they've already given us, it would be a difficult thing to do. It's always good to remember that Rolex is about gradual updates, glacially slow at times, that the changes they make are so small, so minuscule that you might not even notice. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but judging by the demand, the market, the fact that these watches are unobtainable, they don't need to be updated. And I don't believe Rolex sees this as a time now to change it until 2026, 10 years on from the introduction of the ceramic bezel steel variation. And if we look at the Submariner and its track record, 2010 being the time we saw the Supercase, 2020 we saw the evolution of that watch. And even though 2023 is an important anniversary year, 2026 will be the time for that great step to improve this watch further. To that original point where the Daytona was originally introduced in stainless steel, it's now seen as the precious metal flagship. I think the brand is moving further and further away from stainless steel representing the Daytona. As painful as it might be to say, I believe it's no longer that kind of sports watch. You know, the way I picture it, once you have the stainless steel Submariner, the stainless GMT, you then pick up a precious metal Daytona. At least that's how I believe they're arranging the portfolio. You know, the irony is that as enthusiasts, we want to see changes made to their most basic steel chronograph. But they have done more for the development of the Daytona through precious metals, through dial variations, bracelets, bezel inserts, than any other sports watch that the family offers. And I find it hilarious that we've been so fixated on stainless steel, but in the background they have created infinite variations in precious metal. So we can see the subtlety to the Daytona, how this watch has already experimented with so many options, but how they also aim to keep the stainless steel variation pure, unmarked. Like you, as much as I would love to see that great scenario of a 2020 example where we're just flooded with new variations of Daytonas, an entirely new range, I feel like we're going to be seeing the latter, where precious metal is emphasized to celebrate the anniversary, and that steel is going to be used elsewhere. Safe to say, I think you can tell I'm not expecting a huge revelation with releases this year, sadly. But then again, judging by last year's launch and how different those watches were, I think we might also be in for a surprise from another family. Might be a Milgauss, might be yet another variation of the steel Daytona that we haven't seen before. Sky is truly the limit. I just don't think they're going to be making such a grand step in the development of this watch that we might think. I'll stand by it and say that I believe the future of the Daytona is not going to be celebrated in steel as much anymore, and that precious metal better emphasizes this watch, which is now put on a pedestal above every other piece in the family, that this is their flagship and should be celebrated with the artisanal quality, with many different variations that we've never seen before. As far as outlandish designs go, the Daytona definitely takes the cake, especially when we see what they've done in the past. And I don't think this will stop anytime soon. So thank you very much for taking the time to watch this video, and I'll see you in the next one.